Well, I don't know about you guys, but actually, this is one of the lectures I enjoy quite a bit, and I really appreciate what's going on in this lecture, or what Descartes' getting at. Maybe, it wasn't completely clear what exactly he's doing in terms of like procedure and like why he's going and introducing these, and then the evil genius. Maybe that wasn't entirely clear to you, but I do think one of the reasons why I like Descartes and going through this stuff is I do think it's easy to relate to kind of what he's suggesting, okay? And it really gets you thinking then and starting to question things, right? So, I mean, because we've all had very vivid dreams, right, where we wake up and we're sweating profusely and we're thanking God or whatever it is we believe in that wasn't real, all right? Are you guys immune from that? I mean, surely you've all had dreams like that, okay? And so it felt just like this feels. I mean, every bit is real, right? There was no meaningful distinction between how this feels right now and how we felt in the dream, right? So we can all appreciate kind of those points. We've all had our senses deceive us in these basic elementary ways. So we can appreciate they're fallible. They make mistakes, right? They're prone to mistakes, okay? So again, that's one of the reasons why I do appreciate kind of like what's going on in Descartes here, because again, it's easy to relate to, I feel like, and it really does get us to start questioning things, right, in a deep sort of way. So again, maybe not, his reasoning why he's going from one move, making one move to another move, making that move. Maybe some of that's not clear, and hopefully, again, this lecture then will help clarify some of that. But I do think one of the things I appreciate about, again, what he's doing in this is that he's making some very relatable points. Okay? So who is this dude named René Descartes? We've fleetingly mentioned Descartes back in the first lecture. We talked about the history of philosophy, all right? And in the process of discussing that, I can't remember if it was in this section or not, but somebody actually asked when we were going through the modern philosophers, and I mentioned Descartes, isn't he a mathematician? And I said, yes. He's arguably almost as famous for being a really respectable mathematician as he is a philosopher. So yeah, very much a mathematician, a very good mathematician. Obviously a philosopher, French. I do have his dates there, 1596 to 1650. Often called the father of modern philosophy. So that's I think something that I haven't mentioned yet, kind of noteworthy, and that's for good reason. I think that title or label is apt, because one of the things we're going to mention is that he really starts the ball rolling. So everybody we're going to talk about kind of moving forward is in some sense responding to whoever preceded them, right? And so that whole process kind of starts with Descartes, right? So Descartes is going to say what he says, and we're going to talk about that in this lecture. And then Locke is going to more or less respond to Descartes, right? And Hume and Berkeley are more or less responding to Locke, right? And Quine's responding to them, and so on and so forth, right? So I think, again, that label of being the father of modern philosophy is a pretty apt description, okay? Because he really does get a lot of this started, and specifically this kind of epistemological stuff that we're getting into. And specifically, so I think this is maybe on the next slide, one of the things he does is kind of introduce this fundamental dichotomy that kind of underlies a lot of epistemological discussions nowadays, this distinction or dichotomy between the subject or the knower and then the object or what's being known, right, in that knowledge process. Descartes' really the first one that sort of thrusts that to the forefront of discussions and really highlights that. And so he's going to emphasize, as we'll see, the importance or significance of this, the knower, and perhaps argue that really, insofar as we can be certain of anything, it lies in the cognition of the knower. Okay? And we're going to see with like Locke moving forward, all right, he's going to be one who's going to emphasize this. So like Locke's going to suggest, granted all we experience are the ideas in our minds, those are still what we're experiencing, and these ideas and our so-called knowledge is still a result of our interaction with, let's say, the external world, the physical world around us, right? It's affecting us, these bodies, these external bodies around us, this physical world has qualities, certain qualities that affect us in certain ways so that we then have those ideas that we have, right? So he's one, I would say, who kind of emphasizes and accentuates the significance of the objects that we're coming to know and how they're affecting us in certain ways, okay? But regardless of who's emphasizing what, the whole point here was Descartes really gets that process started, right, and really starts the discussion. okay, and carefully distinguishing between these two in some sense. So I mentioned the second bullet point there, that our excerpt is taken from his Meditations on First Philosophy, or as is often, they're usually referred to as just Descartes' Meditations. And, basically we read, if you were to take any Philosophy 100 class, we read what you would usually read, right? So usually it's the first meditation and maybe some parts of the second meditation. And that's exactly what we read. What's kind of interesting is he wrote, did they mention this? I might have mentioned this in the preface, but he wrote one meditation on each day, like six successive days, right? So there were 6 meditations, although usually most people only read, in terms of a class like this, they only read the first and second. And just FYI, it gets progressively more optimistic. So obviously a lot of what we're going to talk about, very skeptical, right? It's very almost gloomy, right? But just FYI, the stuff we didn't read, the subsequent meditations, they do turn a lot more positive, you might say. So Meditations on First Philosophy, published in 1641, probably his most famous work. He does have the Discourse on the Method, another one of his kind of famous works as well, but usually I would say most, especially students in your shoes or position, if insofar as they're encountering Descartes, it's usually exactly what we read, the first meditation and parts of the second. So yeah, he's interested in all kinds of, I would say, fascinating aspects of philosophy, right? We've talked about kind of the whole epistemology stuff and the question of, what we can even know or if we even have any knowledge. And that whole notion of certainty, we're going to get into that in a moment. Descartes is certainly one who works with the idea that knowledge entails certainty. Okay? And we talked about that in the previous lecture. But yeah, so he's interested in exploring knowledge, existence, the self, what are we? So especially that second meditation, it starts to get a little bit more positive, right? And he's going to get into kind of this notion, I think, therefore I have to exist in some capacity. What am I that's existing? Like fundamentally, what is my identity? Right? What are we as humans fundamentally or essentially? What is it not possible to imagine ourselves existing without? Okay, so that's kind of what he gets into in the second meditation. But yeah, so up to a lot, and again, pretty interesting in how he proceeds. So he's tackling some pretty intense subjects, knowledge, can we even know anything? And actually, one of the things I like about him is kind of how he progresses in a very Socratic fashion. That's another one of these slides here we'll get to in a moment, right? He's sick of entertaining these false beliefs throughout his life. He's tired of the pretenses of knowledge. Sounds very Socratic in that sense, right? And he wants to just get rid of all the false stuff and keep just the stuff that he can be certain of, right? So that's ultimately the upshot, his objective in our reading, more or less. But anyway, going back so to this slide, I referenced this briefly earlier, right? So one of the things he's kind of known for is kind of putting this on the map for the first time, or really kind of emphasizing this, that there is this kind of distinction or dichotomy, right? In terms of the perceptual or knowledge process, right? We can talk about the subject, who's doing the knowing in some sense, the knower, and then whatever's being known or thought to be known, or the object of the knowledge. And so again, he's really the first one to kind of thrust that to the forefront of these philosophical discussions or epistemological discussions. And like I mentioned, the rest of, especially modern philosophy, especially epistemological modern philosophy, is going to be kind of concerned with teasing out what exactly this relationship looks like. Okay. All right. Let me fix this here. So I already referenced some similarities to Socrates, at least in my mind. So we had a couple lectures where we really dove into Socrates and his character, okay? And we talked all about how he sets upon a quest to find someone with true wisdom, okay, and kind of more or less fails in that process, right? But we obviously saw with Socrates this concern for knowledge, wanting to find true wisdom somewhere, if it exists, okay, if someone has it. And conversely, right, this kind of, desire to shun or get rid of false ideas, right? These pretenses of wisdom or knowledge. And so you see the same you get the same vibe from Descartes, right? He begins the reading by more or less saying, I'm fed up, right? I've gone through my life, and various points in time I've been in error, right? I've been misled in my beliefs. I believe things that turned out to be false, okay? And I'm sick of that. And I've told myself at some point I'm going to sit down and really think through things and try to figure out what I can actually know, or what I know with certainty. And that time is now, right? I'm going to finally do that. Is kind of what he suggests. Okay, so again, he proceeds in a very Socratic manner, seeking to know things he can be absolutely certain of. Okay, I'm tired of the illusions, the false beliefs. What, if anything, can I actually be certain of? So like Descartes, he begins by stressing his distaste for the false opinions and pretenses of wisdom that he himself has kind of exhibited at times, or been guilty of himself, right? Thinking certain things were true when they really weren't. Okay. So he wants to get to the bottom of it, so to speak, figure out what he can truly be convinced of. Okay. So, and of course, he's going to have a sort of process to try to do that, right? A method, if you will. Okay. So basically he suggests, in order to do this, to see kind of what I can be truly convinced of, my method then is going to be, or how I'm going to try to do this, is to try to doubt everything. So what's his method in this first meditation, at least? Doubt, right? Let's try to doubt as much as we can. And the idea being, I'm going to sit down, put a lot of thought into this, as best I can, try to doubt all of my beliefs. I'm going to put them all to the test, right? And be as skeptical about them as I can. And then the idea is, if anything survives that extreme kind of skepticism, that sort of treatment, the idea is if anything survives that, well, then it seems like it's something I can be certain of or convinced of. So let's expose all of our beliefs to this extreme doubt and skepticism, okay, through these various steps. And the idea, again, is if anything actually survives that, well, then it must be something that we can be convinced of, that we can be certain of. Okay, because we were as skeptical about it as possible, and it still survived, so to speak. Okay, so he begins by subjecting all of his former beliefs to scrutiny and determining which of them he is justified in doubting, or at least he's going to try to do that. And it seems like through these steps, at least ostensibly at the end of Meditation 1, it seems like he ended up doubting everything. Okay, but we'll see if that's actually the case. But going back to the beginning, quote, I will, in short, apply myself earnestly and openly to the general destruction of my former opinions. I'm going to try as best I can to doubt all of them, and as thoroughly as possible. As he'll say later in a quote, right, it's not through frivolity or a lack of genuine interest and consideration. No, I'm really giving these a lot of thought. I'm going to try to doubt them and be as skeptical about all these beliefs as I can, so that then I can be truly confident and certain that whatever remains afterwards, are beliefs that I can confidently hold or uphold. Okay, so now we get the stairway to doubt. That's just my catchy phrasing. Okay. So Descartes' stairway to doubt. This is kind of, again, encapsulating that method of doubt. So on your exams, okay, if you're writing on an essay, let's say on a question about Descartes, okay, you're going to want to be able to obviously illuminate all the steps in this so-called stairway to doubt. Okay, you're going to need to do that for a decent grade. But there's more to it. Why does he actually have to take each of these steps? Okay, you're going to want to know that as well. And we're going to get into that. Why is it not good enough just to posit that our senses are susceptible, they're fallible, right? They're susceptible to error. They can be mistaken. Why is acknowledging that not enough to doubt all of our beliefs? Why doesn't it go far enough? You're going to need to know that, right? Why does he then need to take this second step? And then, albeit very powerful, why is the dream argument, and this, by the way, ties into this, why is the dream argument also not sufficient to doubt all of his beliefs? Okay, you want to be able to answer that, okay, and speak to then why each of these successive steps needs to be taken. Okay, but ultimately the idea is when we get here, at least ostensibly, again, at the end of the first meditation, it seems like at this apex of doubt, this summit, the top of the skeptical mountain, where the evil genius lies, it seems like we are in a position then to doubt everything we thought we knew, right? All of our beliefs. But there's a big but, of course, right? And we see that then at the very beginning of the second meditation. Maybe I can't quite doubt everything, okay? But I'm foreshadowing too much already, okay? I wanted to mention at this point again, here's a rough sort of pictorial representation of the moves he's going to make. So be familiar with this stairway to doubt, these various steps, but then also know why he has to take each of those steps, okay? All right, well, let's start with step 1. Okay, he begins by analyzing what he suggests he's always been seemingly most certain of, and that's what his sense perception tells him, his sense experience, okay? What he gets by way of the senses. As he says, quote, from 2:10, whatever I had admitted until now as most true, I took in either from the senses or through the senses. Okay? And this usually solicits the most confidence in terms of his beliefs. Okay? But he immediately points out that our senses sometimes mislead us. This one, by the way, right before our senses, just signals like this is the first move, the first step. Okay? So look, our senses are fallible. They can be mistaken. Are we all familiar, like if you look at an object, like say a pencil in water, that it appears bent, and if we didn't know any different, like if we weren't any the wiser, we would think, oh, that's a bent pencil. Okay? But it's not. But that's what our senses seem to suggest to us. Okay, or maybe we see, what seems to be our best friend there in the distance. He's way down there over the hill, like barely visible, right? Oh, that looks like Buddha. Yo, Buddha, what's up? And he comes a little closer and you realize it's a complete stranger who's looking at you like, what's gotten into that wacko, right? So again, perceptions, right, our sense perceptions can be misleading, can be faulty, can screw up. Okay? And we can all relate to this, right? And so he points out, well, why should I trust anything that is susceptible to error, right? If it's been an error once, it could be an error again. Like, how do I ever know that it's not an error like what it's giving me right now? Okay? But what's he point out? Yeah, still, isn't there a difference between, like, things appearing a certain way in certain mediums like water, right? Or like, it's one thing to think you see your friend in the far distance, okay? But isn't it something different, like to question you guys being here right now? Or as he says, that I'm riding right beside this fire, wouldn't it be something significantly different to doubt the fire right beside you, or that you guys are right here? Okay, that's a little different than doubting or questioning whether that's really Buddha a half a mile away, right? Does that make sense? It seems like he wants to say, granted, our senses can be mistaken. They are fallible. They can be prone to error. There still seem to be things that we can be fairly convinced of. Right? Do we ever really doubt that we're right here in this room right now? Okay, but then what's he say? So this is why we need to take another step, right? So this is the explanation why this move is necessary. Because it seems like, granted, we do have basic sensory illusions or errors. It still seems like some of our senses or our perceptions are some more resolute, right? They don't seem like something we're as likely to doubt, okay? That you guys are literally sitting right before me right now. Okay? That's different than doubting that someone is truly Buddha in the far distance. Okay? So everybody appreciate that? So we need something more to put us in a position to credibly doubt, like that people are right before us, or that there's a fire right beside me as I'm riding. Well, what can give us a good reason to maybe question even that stuff? Come on now. What's step 2? Dreams, right? If we just consider dreams. You guys have all been just like this right before me in my dreams, okay? And I was equally convinced, or should I say nightmares? Just kidding. All right, so I was equally convinced that was happening then. There's no meaningful distinction between how I felt in that dream or nightmare versus how I feel right now. So there goes those seemingly more convincing perceptions as well, right? That you guys are right here. So here we have the dream hypothesis or argument. Okay, this gives us a reason to maybe call into question you guys being here right now. Even the fire right beside Descartes as he's writing. Okay? We've had equally vivid impressions in our dreams. And then we wake up sweating profusely thinking, whatever we believe in, right? That it was just a dream or a nightmare. Okay? So how can we know or be certain of even these seemingly more convincing perceptions? Right? It could all be almost wholesale, right? Dreams, if we entertain the dream possibility, the idea is our perceptions could be wholesale illusory, right? Not just, they're fallible or could be prone to error, like entirely, systemically, right? Everything we're perceiving right now could just be an error or an illusion, right? If I'm dreaming, okay? So it seems to call into question, again, even those more convincing impressions that we have or sense perceptions. Okay? And formally, if we're going to spell out kind of the dream argument, so here you see, by the way, number 2, right, the second step, listed after, right before dreaming on the slide. Okay? But the formal argument for this, okay, it's basically what we call a modus ponens, and I think I mentioned this in lecture 2. If you take Philosophy 103, we would go through this in much more detail. Okay, but basically, Descartes offers us more or less a modus ponens argument. Okay, he says, first of all, if it's possible that I'm dreaming, then I can't be certain of my beliefs. And then, hey, it's possible I'm dreaming. I can never be sure that I'm not. There's no meaningful distinction between how things seem right now and how they seem when I'm dreaming. Okay, so I could be dreaming. Well, then, I can't be certain of my beliefs. That is the fundamental argument. Okay. So, in view of that, he's saying, since my objective is to try to doubt everything I can, as best as I can, I'm going to suppose then that I'm dreaming from this point forward. Okay. Is that good enough, though? Can he doubt everything? No, obviously not, right? We've got another step over here. Okay, well, what is it that it doesn't seem like we can doubt, even granting or supposing that we're dreaming? What still seems to stand up to that scrutiny or possibility? How about, he says, things like math? Doesn't that seem consistent, whether we're dreaming or awake? Right? Doesn't 2 + 2 always equal 4? In some sense, aren't colors always kind of consistent, whether we're dreaming or not? He says also, granted, maybe a particular table that I'm perceiving isn't real, right? I'm just dreaming it up. He says, even if that's the case, even if we suppose all these objects, right, I'm just dreaming right now, doesn't it still have to be the case that there really are these, ultimately at some point, right, real objects upon which all these dreamed up tables and other objects are based? Otherwise, where do we get the very notion or idea of a table, unless one actually exists at some point, right? So his point is, even if everything I'm even if everything I'm perceiving right now is just a dream, including, let's say, this table, right, there still has to be some reality upon which those dreamed up objects are based, right? A real table at some point. Otherwise, where did this notion of a table come from? Okay, so again, it seems like there are certain kind of beliefs we can entertain and think are true, even if we suppose that we're dreaming. Hence, the dream argument doesn't quite go far enough. Okay, so that's what this slide captures. Okay. That top point is just the point about the table. So in his words, this is from 210, quote, nevertheless, it really must be admitted that things seen in sleep are, as it were, like painted images, which could have been produced only in the likeness of true things or real things, things that aren't dreamt up, right? There has to be somewhere, ultimately, at some point, a real table. Otherwise, where did that idea of a table come from? Okay. And then, whether awake or asleep, certain elements of his experience, again, whether dreaming or not, always seem to remain consistent or the same. Again, math, basic math, right? Logical inferences, certain sorts of, logical inferences we can make, right? They seem to be kind of true or consistent whether we're dreaming or awake. Okay, so just positing that we're dreaming isn't going to give us license to doubt them then. Okay, so that's where, or why I should say, we need then the almighty evil genius who, I guess, resides at the top of the stairway to doubt, waiting to deceive us about everything. Okay, so how do I doubt even the things that seem consistent, whether I'm dreaming or awake? Well, I imagine that instead of there being an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God, I imagine there's an all-powerful, all-knowing, not-so-good God, all evil, let's say, who for whatever reason just likes toying with our minds and making us think nothing but false beliefs. So maybe this evil genius was just making me think my whole life that 2 + 2 = 4, the colors exist in the way they do, okay, et cetera, et cetera. So by introducing this evil genius, it seems like we then can doubt even those other things. Math, right? The very idea that there's an ultimate table somewhere, right? Maybe he's deceiving us about even that. Okay, so positing the evil genius, at least ostensibly at the end of the first meditation, right, seems to put us in a position to actually legitimately, for the first time, truly doubt everything we thought we knew. Quote, this is from 2:11. How do I know that he, that is the evil genius, did not bring it about that there be no earth at all, no heaven, no extended thing, no figure, no size, no place? All of it's just illusory, right? And yet all these things should seem to me to exist precisely as they appear to do now. That's possible. And if I entertain that possibility, it seems like then I am actually in a position then to doubt everything I believed. It could all be an illusion created by the evil genius. So for the time being, as mentioned at the bottom, it seems like the evil genius then, provides us with a satisfactory reason to doubt everything. So he concludes, quote, there is nothing among the things I once believed to be true which it is not permissible to doubt at this point, right? Sort of hypothesizing the evil genius. Not for reasons of frivolity or a lack of forethought. So in other words, again, this is after considerable thought, right, and really wrestling with these issues, okay, and debating this. But because of valid and considered arguments. Okay, and again, we have literally a dream argument here, as we talked about. Okay? So again, I've given this considerable thought, and this is, right, the upshot of that reflection. Okay? Now we've touched upon this theme before. We talked about, for example, we mentioned it in conjunction with our discussion of skepticism in the last lecture. I mentioned how even the penultimate skeptic, right, David Hume, okay, the skeptic of all skeptics, a lot of these skeptics, in fact, right, they're going to constantly, or at least at times, mention how difficult it is to be skeptical, right? That this isn't easy to doubt things, to be skeptical. In some sense, to be philosophical about stuff. I mean, and you might kind of construe philosophy as more or less just asking questions about things, right? Or, questioning things and being skeptical about things in some sense. Okay? He says, look, this isn't easy. And he makes kind of similar points, like I mentioned with Russell and Hume, like you got to be practical. You still have to go to your job. You got to go to school. You got to put food on the plate. Okay? We don't want to turn into young Sheldons who switch their major to philosophy and then can't get out of bed, right? We got to be practical. This isn't easy. And even if we try to be super skeptical, as we pointed out in previous lectures, it seems to be like human nature just to accept a lot of this, right? And so the whole point here is Descartes also ruminates on some of this stuff, right, and observes these same kinds of points, right? This is not easy. It's arduous, as he puts it, I believe, right? It's difficult. Okay? And most people aren't even really capable of entertaining this sort of skepticism, like any of it really, right? It's human nature to not question this stuff. And so he highlights and emphasizes or accentuates the power of custom and habit and human nature, and how, again, most of us are just going to, again, it's it's on par with breathing, right? We just automatically breathe. Well, we just automatically suppose this is really happening right now, right? We don't really question it. Okay? And he's just pointing out that's the norm for most of us. Okay? So that's how he closes the first meditation, is basically suggesting this. Okay? It's almost like you get the sense that he's been through a lot, right? And I guess he has, in some sense. Okay? As he puts it, I think I have a quote here at the bottom. Quote, this undertaking is arduous, and laziness brings me back to my customary way of living, at least for the rest of the night. So it's a bit heavy, right? It's not easy. It's a little scary, maybe. And so I'm going to retire for a little bit. So he'll wake up the next day and then write the second meditation, which as we'll see, does turn slightly more positive. Okay? Because what's he going to suggest? It seems like with the evil genius, we can doubt everything, right? But is that true? Is there something that even the evil genius can't get us to doubt? What's he say? Just like an imagined God. So who is the evil genius? Yeah, just like a hypothetical, maybe real, we don't know, right? That's part of the issue is like, what if this dude really does exist? Then everything I thought was real and that I believed in could be false, right? So, but who is the evil genius? It's not him, it's not anything that we know to be real, right? It's just like a hypothetical. Imagine there was this entity, like God, but kind of not good, right? And then all of this would follow, okay? So it seems like I said, after positing the evil genius, we have valid reasons to call everything we believed into doubt. But is that true? What's he going to say in the second meditation? Look, even if this evil genius is deceiving me all the time, he's deceiving me, right? Me, I must exist, all right? Anytime I think, or let's call it, am being deceived, okay, whatever you want to call that thought, or whatever's going on here, doesn't that at least imply that something's existing to have that perception, have that thought, have that illusion? If the evil genius is deceiving you, you have to exist to be deceived, fundamentally, right? I mean, doesn't that seem to follow? And so the evil genius, it does seem like, can get us to doubt almost everything, but not quite everything, right? I mean, I still have to exist even if I posit the evil genius and posit that he is deceiving me in everything I believe. I still have to exist to be being deceived. Okay? Does that make sense? And so with that, the first meditation comes to a close. Of course, he acknowledges how tough all this is. It's not fun. I'm sick of it. I need to retire for a while. Okay. So then the next day, we wake up afresh and we start a second meditation. And at the beginning, you might have noticed he kind of starts off, well, let's kind of review where we're at, right? I'm going to search for, as I've been sort of suggesting from the get-go, something I can be certain of. So in view of what we've discussed in the first meditation, he begins the second meditation basically saying, in view of all that, let's see if there is then anything I can still be certain of, factoring all the things we said in the first meditation. Okay, so he's going to search for something he can, as I mentioned here, be certain of despite his reasons for doubting everything. As he says, quote, I will go forward until I know something certain, or if nothing else, until at least I know for certain that nothing is certain. That really reminds me of Socrates. All I know is that I know nothing. Maybe that's what I'll come to, but I just want to know, again, with certainty what I can know, if anything. Maybe it's the case that I'll come to know that I don't know anything, a la Socrates. Okay, so as I intimated at the bottom of the slide, he's going to, as we'll see, suggest, maybe there is something, right, I can be certain of. And the second meditation, that's something he can be certain of as himself, as we'll see. So the second meditation, after kind of coming to that realization, is going to be more or less him working out then what this self is. What is this I that must exist? Okay, but so kind of foreshadowing on the path of the second meditation here. So at the beginning, though, right, he's kind of, again, recollecting what he went through in the first meditation, establishes, again, that he's after what he can know with certainty, and maybe he'll come to the conclusion that all he can know with certainty is that he doesn't know anything with certainty. Okay? Maybe that'll be the case, but we'll see. So since he's going to presume false anything that admits of even the slightest doubt, okay, if it's deceived him before, it's out. Okay, it's capable of being faulty. Okay? So he's going to toss out anything that solicited doubt at all. Okay, so there goes objects of immediate sensation, right? Sense perception. Again, he could just be being deceived by the evil genius the whole time. Everything associated with sense perception, okay, we have to toss out the window because it could just be the evil genius always having deceived us, right, with respect to everything we've ever thought we've known via sense perception. So obviously the immediate objects of sense perception, gone, and pretty much anything based on that as well. So there goes objects that our memories represent, because that's all rooted in sense perception, more or less, right? So that could have all been based in illusion. Objects we imagine, because what are we working with there? The objects of our sense perception. Okay, well again, that could have all been illusory thanks to the evil genius. So anything we're imagining, that can't solicit any certainty, because that's also rooted in the illusory sense perceptions. Okay? And so anything dealing with the senses in general, body, figure, extension, motion, and place. Anything corporeal, by the way, that's kind of a term you'll hear in philosophy, and especially in these discussions. If you were wondering, like, what does that word mean, just FYI. Corporeal, anybody know? Corporeal? Nobody? Just means bodily, physical. Okay. Okay, so anything corporeal in nature. Basically the gist, that makes sense given the gist of the first meditation. But here's his famous aha moment. What's he suggest here? So even tossing everything dealing with sense perception out the window, maybe there's something else. Remember that subject-object dichotomy that we put up on the board? And we mentioned how Descartes' really going to emphasize the subject, the knower. All right. Well, he says, well, maybe there's something wholly different from everything I've been analyzing so far, wherein we can locate some degree of certainty, right? Maybe I've been focusing too much on just, for example, that subject-object dichotomy on that one side. Okay, what if we turn our attention maybe to the cognition itself, or the knower, him or herself? Maybe we can find some element of certainty there, and that's precisely what happens. So he says on 212, quote, "On what grounds do I know that there is nothing over and above all those which I have just reviewed, concerning which there is not even the least cause for doubt?" Maybe there's something else I can look at besides sense perception, or corporeal, bodily sense perception. And here's where we get then his famous Cogito ergo sum, right? So is there something we can be certain of, even supposing an evil genius exists, right, and tossing out all of our empirical corporeal sense perception? Is there something the evil genius can't even make us doubt? And what's he say? Famously, right? Well, even the evil genius can't take it from me that anytime I think, even if it's all deception, don't I still have to exist in order to have that deception in the first place? Don't I have to exist if there's any thought going on, even if it is all illusory? I have to exist for that to take place in the first place. Does that make sense? So this is, again, his kind of aha moment. Even if he can't be confident of these empirical sense perceptions, he still has these sensations. He's still experiencing them. And so doesn't he have to exist to experience it in the first place? Regardless of whatever its true nature is. Illusion, reality, right? Maybe these sense perceptions really are indicative of what's going on, or not. Regardless, don't I have to exist to have these perceptions, regardless of their ultimate nature? Quote, "Therefore, am I not at least something, regardless of the true nature of these perceptions?" Hence, regarding his evil genius, Descartes asserts, quote, "He can never bring it about that I am nothing, so long as I shall think that I am something." Every moment I'm thinking, right? I have to exist. Every moment I'm being deceived, right? Even granting, assuming for the sake of argument that the evil genius does exist. Every moment he's deceiving me, I have to exist to be deceived. So he finally finds something he considers to be certain. The proposition, I exist, is necessarily true every time it is uttered by me or conceived in my mind. It has to be. So he's found his element of certainty. You guys see the move here? I've been focusing wholesale up to this point on the process of empirical sensation. What if I look to the knower, him or herself? Is there something therein where I can find some element of certainty? Yes. The very act of thinking itself provides some element of certainty. If the thought is happening, something must exist. That I can be certain of. So we have found some degree of certainty. And in fact, the only thing we can be certain of lies in the cognition of the knower. All right, so the only thing we can be certain of, remember that subject-object dichotomy, the only thing we can be certain of is rooted in the subject, in the cognition of the knower. And that's where, why Descartes is going to be, attached to this rationalism. Okay? insofar as we can know anything, right? The most convincing source of any knowledge, right, lies in something outside of our empirical sense perception, okay? What the empiricists accentuate or emphasize. Okay, so more on that rationalism. We'll close with that. But so he's found what he thinks he can be certain of, right? Himself. Again, even if he's constantly being deceived, he has to exist to be deceived. So from this point forward, it turns a little bit more positive. Okay, I have to exist. Anytime I'm thinking, even if I suppose I'm constantly being deceived, I have to exist. But what? So now the question, right? It's no longer like a question of like what we can know or what we can be certain of. It's a question, well, what am I? Kind of a anthropological question. What does it mean? What are we essentially? What is this I? And this, is an equally famous and interesting sort of portion of Descartes then, where he's going to kind of suggest, what is it that we essentially are? The approach for figuring this out is whatever you can kind of imagine yourself existing without, then that's not really vital or essential to your identity, to what you really are, right? Because you can imagine yourself existing without it, right? So to get to what you truly are, what's essential to your identity, it has to be something or those facets of you that you can't imagine yourself existing without, okay? Well, what about all that bodily, corporeal stuff? Remember what he says, we can imagine ourselves existing, right? We could suppose the evil genius, right, is existing, and all that stuff's illusory. And yet, I could still have to exist. So even, right, we can imagine ourselves existing, in other words, without all that stuff, and we know that we would still have to exist, right? So none of that corporeal stuff is going to be essential, in other words, right? It can't really be the defining feature or features of what we are, since we can imagine ourselves existing completely removed of all that stuff, right? If we suppose the evil genius exists, then all that stuff might not be, this might not really be here, right? But something else still is existing, right? I still have to exist, okay, in some sense, this thought, this cognition. Okay, so again, since we can assume, right, that the evil genius exists, in which case none of this corporeal bodily stuff would exist, including our own bodies, and yet, right, we can be certain that we still have to exist, then none of that bodily stuff is truly essential to our identity then. Okay. Instead, what does seem essential to our identity? What is it impossible to imagine existing without? What's he say? The mind, thought, cogito, cognition. Okay. I think, therefore I am. Right? So that cognitive element of us, whether it's indicative of what's really happening out there somewhere, or it's all illusory, right? That element is what he associates with our identity, first and foremost, right? You can't imagine yourself existing without that. Okay, whereas you can imagine yourself existing without a right arm, without a left arm, without both arms, right? Without legs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? And we're going to see again, did I mention the Metallica video to you guys last time? I know I did to some of the other sections, but the best kind of parallel to this is the music video One by Metallica, and I always forget the classic novel that it's based on, but it's based on a novel, and it's basically like a wartime scenario where a soldier gets blown up by a landmine, and basically, yeah, I know, real pretty scenario, right? But basically then is in this situation where like he is totally, and we'll see, I'll play it for you here in a little bit, but is basically completely cut off from the world of sensation, right? There's no, he doesn't have any sense of touch anymore, taste, etc., right? It's all removed, okay? But he's still existing. And what type of existence is it? Have you guys seen the video? Okay, like, is it a pretty happy sort of existence? No, he's actually communicating Morse code, kill me, kill me, kill me. So I don't know. I guess that doesn't bode well for our essential identity if we're just these. Anyway, right? So to me, that's always been kind of the best way to kind of visualize what this would look like. Like, what would it be like to exist completely removed from any empirical sensation? Because that's what Descartes says we fundamentally are. We could imagine, again, existing without any of that, and we would still be ourselves. Okay? Again, maybe that video will hopefully kind of give us an impression of what that would be like. So anyway, he says, what's fundamental? What is What are we essentially, fundamentally? Thinking things, right? That thought, that cognition is what we can't imagine ourselves existing without. Whereas all that bodily stuff, we could, literally lose limbs and it would still be us, right? It's hard to imagine, like I said, completely losing all corporeal sensation whatsoever, like all arms, legs, etc., not being able to taste, smell, etc. That's a little hard to envision. And again, that video, with the Metallica video, kind of, I think is a nice parallel. But he's basically saying that's possible to be completely cut off, right? It could all be illusory anyway. And yet we'd still, right, we can still imagine ourselves existing. We would still, in reality, still exist. Okay, so hence, none of that corporeal stuff can truly be essential to our identity. Instead, what is essential? The thought, the cognition. That stuff, we can't remove that thinking component and still suppose that we exist. Right? So that's why, that's where he, right, that cognition of the knower, that's where he roots our identity. That's what we essentially are. As he puts it on 213, quote, "Here I discover that thought is an attribute that really does belong to me. This alone cannot be detached from me." Again, everything else we could sort of envision ourselves existing without, okay, but not this thought. "I am therefore precisely only a thing that thinks, that is, a mind or soul or intellect or reason." Okay. In fact, not only is that what I am, that's the only thing I can know with certainty. At least at this point in the meditations. Okay. Everything else could be illusory, all right, but I must exist. Okay? And so hopefully you can see again why he's thought to represent the rationalist camp. Okay? Our entire sense perception, all right, or what we experience, this empirical realm of sensation, could be illusory. And not really indicative of any kind of true knowledge, if you will. Right? The one thing we can know, seemingly from Descartes, lies in not the empirical realm of experience, or however you want to put it, but rather in the cognition of the knower, him or herself. Right? And the cognition or the reason of the knower. Okay? And so far as we can know anything, it's there. And he does think we can know that with certainty. Right? So anyway, as the editors point out, quote, this is from 209 in the preface to our excerpt, quote, "The result is a type of rationalism in which the only certainties are discovered by the mind through self-evident insight or reason." Okay, we don't look to experience, and specifically experience of the empirical realm of sensation for knowledge, because again, that could all be totally misguided, wholesale illusory, not indicative of any true knowledge. Okay, if we have any capacity for knowledge at all, it lies in things we can come to know through the cognition of the knower, him or herself. Okay, so that is kind of the essence of rationalism. And that's why Descartes is associated with rationalism. Do you guys have any questions on rationalism or Descartes or any of the things he's done here? Okay, this is a pretty famous portion of philosophy. So I began the lecture by mentioning how I appreciate Descartes because he makes a lot of relatable points. Again, we've all had very vivid dreams. I mentioned how maybe you didn't really understand as you were reading it. And again, this is just me kind of maybe guessing as rookies. You didn't know why he went from one to the next, but hopefully that's all clear. You know why he has to go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3. Okay, and then how he finally finds some element of certainty even after he climbs the stairway of doubt. He didn't really, even when he reached that apex of doubt, right? He doesn't actually have good reason to doubt everything, as we learn in meditation too, right? There's still something that survives that stairway to doubt. What is it? His thought. That he is at least thinking and existing, even if he's constantly being deceived. Okay? So there is something that survives this radical skepticism. No questions, comments, concerns? All right, let's break up into our groups and do a little bit of reflection. I do want to start on empiricism, so I'll probably give you like maybe 5 minutes to chat about this stuff. So this is, again, a very famous portion or section of philosophy, you might say, right? Descartes' skepticism here. So curious to hear what you guys thought. Let's make this bigger here. So what do you guys make of that stairway to doubt? Some pretty interesting moves there. Are you guys maybe convinced? We do have, I mean, not that you want to seriously entertain this stuff, right? We've talked about how you still have to live a practical life, but does it resonate with you? I mean, does he provide pretty convincing sort of arguments? What do you guys make of that, okay? And then what about this notion that we're essentially thinking things? Does that make sense to you? Or like, if not, what's your alternative, right? So what are you essentially, right? Descartes' fundamental answer is a thinking thing. I can imagine or suppose that I exist without anything else, right? But thought always has to be there. Right? Okay, if you're going to want to reject that and say, no, that doesn't seem quite right, well, what is your answer then? What are we essentially then? Right? Do you want to insist, well, no, we are in some sense some kind of body as well, right? So what is your response to that? So go ahead and break up into your groups again and then chat about those couple questions, and we'll reconvene. I would like to hear what you guys think as well about this stuff, and then we'll move on to Locke and empiricism.